Next lecture is in memory of Kozo Uno. Kozo Uno based his works on a rigorously Hegelian readings of Marx's Capital. This led him to his well-known conclusion that Marxian analysis had to be conducted at 3 separate levels: the pure theory of capital, freed from the complications of history, highly abstract exercise in dialectical logic, the basic core dynamics of capitalist economy. Uno and his followers have come in for criticism from the wider Marxist tradition for insisting on this separation: principles of political economy, theory of a purely capitalist society. This lecture is titled Marx and Asia. How did Asia reshape Marx's conception of revolution and history? And will be delivered by Professor Lin Chun. Can I please request our speaker to come on stage? This lecture will be chaired by Professor Kipton Jensen. Can I request our chair to please come on stage? Professor Jensen, please take over the proceedings.
Hello. Our penultimate lecture will be presented by Professor Lin, who received her doctorate at Cambridge University. She presently teaches at the London School of Economics and publishes in both English and Chinese. Her research interests are in historical sociology, political economy, and social theory. She's the author of The British New Left, The Transformation of Chinese Socialism, Reflections on China's Reform Trajectory, and China and Global Capitalism. In the interest of time, because we must, because of a scheduled address, conclude our session punctually at 6 o'clock. Professor Lin?
Okay. Can I just say that I know time is tight, but I have to say this. I'm an associate professor, not professor. I mean, I took a full professorship from the New York University 10 years ago, but I decided to return to the London School of Economics, where I'm an associate professor. And I emailed the conference organizers about this, but it must be too late for them to make corrections. And the first thing I told Professor Desai on my arrival was that there was an error in the program. And he says, who cares? You are a professor. But anyway, I'm glad that I have a chance to correct this. And thank you. So, should I go there?
Yes, please.
Hello? Yes. What I really want to say is that I'm very grateful to the Institute and the conference committee and their wonderful organizational and logistic teams for having me as part of this very rewarding event. And I'm honored to give this lecture in the name of Kozo Uno, who's known in China as Yu Guangzhang, very influential political economist. And it is indeed in the Uno tradition of combining or tying political economy and historical movement. I'm trying to do a re-examination of Marx's conception of Asia. So I have 30 minutes? Okay, so what I'm going to do is that Asia, I want to focus on China and India following Marx. That was his focus, so excluding Japan, because for Marx, Japan was even more feudal than European feudal countries. So in other words, it was less Asian than its regional neighbors. But I will also, following Marx, to include Russia. So India, China, Russia, where I use the word Asia. And much of what I prepared to say has already been said. I mean, there were several lectures and papers, quite a number of them touched on what I was going to say. So I'll try my best to not repeat anything. And my main argument is that I think Marx, through his observation on Asia, has actually changed his outlook on history and revolution. So I'm saying this now because if I was over time, just stop me anytime. I'm not sure that I can finish what I have already written here. Okay, so Asia. Let's very briefly trace the evolution of Marx's bifurcated conception of the Orient first. Here, the influence of Hegel was most notable, especially Hegel's philosophy of history that we all know distinguished between the historical nation and so-called peoples without history. But I'll say a word here on the Asiatic mode of production. The mode of production in general had a dual signification: socio-economic formation and marker in historical periodization. Among its structural flaws, among the structural flaws of the so-called Asiatic mode of production, Marx pinned down two basic features. First, as the state was simultaneously also the sole landlord, its revenue was undifferentiated between ground rent and taxation. Centrally administered infrastructural projects were prone to despotism. The second feature is a closed and cyclic village economy combining household farming and handicraft, endlessly reproducing itself. So in Marx's work, nothing can be conceivable as a more solid basis for Asiatic despotism and stagnation. As such, the positioning of AMP, the Asiatic mode of production, in its relational connection with the other modes of production appears problematic. It is a form of primary society in some places in Marx's work, but also a parallel with Asian society at other places in his work. Difficulties in conceptualizing the AMP were measured by such analytical inconsistencies. It's important to note that once the definition or defining feature of AMP is confined to the self-sustaining village system and decoupled, this is important, and decoupled from the state landlord and state-organized construction works, it became identifiable anywhere without geographic specification. So I'll skip the quotes from Marx about this. The point here is that the connotation of the signifier Asiatic turned out to be temporal rather than spatial. Empirical objections. Marx seemed to have dropped the notion of AMP along with Oriental despotism after 1859, while he went on analyzing village communities with even greater attention. Oriental despotism, I mean, the fact that he abandoned Oriental despotism as a notion was indicative of his awareness of its susceptibility. Empirically, the AMP was constructed on thin and shaky evidence. It was, after all, before serious ethnographic research emerged. And Marx became aware of, for example, that there was the lack of private land property in Asia that he saw as the real key to the basic form of all phenomena in the East was actually inaccurate. Depending on how universal history is understood, the concept of Asiatic mode presents either a spectacular failure of Marxism because it prevents a linear succession of the mode of production from being coherently conceptualized, or a remarkable break with the teleological strand in Marxism. The other objection is concerned with the schematized sequence of modes of production. The Asiatic mode in its characterization is missing internal contradictions and dependent on external intervention, and therefore a deviation from the regular track of evolution. This model is thus diluted, again, by logical inconsistency. In defense of Marx, we might note that pre-capitalist modes of production are less theoretical than observational in his work. Marx did not subscribe a mechanical view on the breakdown of any old social formations or their passage to new forms. He showed, for example, that ancient and feudal formations were only contingently connected. Methodologically, Marx traced pre-capitalist evolution because of its pre-capitalist evolution, because of its illustrative value for the genesis of capitalism. For him, until much later, without a causal linkage to the modern bourgeois world, the Oriental, as all the other social-economic formations dominated by land and nature, was theoretically insignificant. Okay. Greed. Sorry, I got my pages wrong. Hold on. All right. Greed reversal, colonial predicament, and revolutions in the East. After defeated 1948 revolutions, thank you. Marx resembled his teams and activities in London. Excuse me. In London, intended just for a short stay, but he stayed, where he continued his work on critiques of political economy, including analyzing Britain's overseas trade relations in his political journalism. The Asian market had been vital for overstretched British imperialism and European as well as world capitalism. Colonial repercussions in Asia, debated in Westminster, became a regular theme of Marx and Engels' writings for the New York Daily Tribune in the 1850s. The last of this cluster of commentaries, titled Chinese Affairs, was published in 1862. Marx viewed colonial extraction of raw materials and labor value as intrinsic to the primitive accumulation of capital through a world market. While breaking news from the East was precarious and mixed, Marx was deeply moved by a revolting landscape of peoples bullied and injured by Britain and other imperialist powers. Discussing capitalist imperialism most pointedly in his NYDT dispatches, Marx wrote many pages on Britain's opium trade, detailing that hazardous operations, in his word, of poison, its production and smuggling process is absolutely appalled. The scale of direct exploitation of India by the British oligarchs was colossal, and the India administration, according to Marx, depends for a full 1/7 of its revenue on opium. In the name of free trade, the East India Company's monopoly was over something worse than slave trade, and the supreme rule of capital. These are Marx's words. But he also stressed the blowback of imperial ambition. I'll skip the quotations. On his due judgment on colonialism, this is all familiar to us, so I'll be brief. Marx was unambiguous in denouncing the greed and cruelty of racist colonialism, in which the civilized drink nectar from the skulls of the lesser breed, in quote. Among his most quoted passage, he wrote that the profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home, where it assumes respectable forms, to the colonies where it goes naked. But his moral dilemma contains simultaneously condemnation and instrumentalism. Less noted is that the completion of the world market for him and the bourgeois mode of production led to substantial modification of Marx's position on colonialism. The cost of the colonial empire, as in the cases of Ireland and India, was borne by the British nation and people in the interest of their rulers. Insofar as colonial power existed, the metropolitan working class was itself enslaved and complicit. Anti-colonial and class struggles were hence mutually indispensable. In fact, as early as 1853, contradicting his own comments elsewhere, Marx already hinted his ultimate judgment on colonialism. The bourgeoisie, in quote, will neither emancipate nor materially mend the social conditions of the masses of the people in the colonies. The Indians would not reap the fruits of any colonial change until in Great Britain itself, the new ruling classes shall have been supplanted by the industrial proletariat, or till the Hindus themselves shall have grown strong enough to throw off the English yoke altogether. This was a brilliant foresight as a nationalist Asia was yet to loom. Revolts in China and India. Marx noted, in particular, on the outbreak of the rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, which was religiously disguised. Marx noted, in particular, among the rebelling plebs, individuals appeared who pointed to the poverty of some and to the wealth of others, and who demanded a different distribution of property, and even the completion or complete abolition of private property. And he was impressed by what was described by a German missionary on the Chinese mobs preaching socialism. As the Taiping Army mobilized massive followers and swept half of the country over a decade, they carried out an egalitarian communal land program. And Marx noticed that the founders of Marxism were so hopeful in 1850 that they saw in this formidable revolution a socialist promise. In quote, it may well be that Chinese socialism is related to European socialism, just as Chinese philosophy is related to Hegelian philosophy. Marx was later disillusioned by the horrifying reports on the terror the rebels inflicted in society, which turned them destructive. India shared the similar conditions with China in the global economy and domestic conflicts, poverty, and pervasive misery. The nationalist Indian mutiny of 1857-58 was also a retort to bleeding process, in Marx's words, of the British exhausting Indian labor and wealth to finance not only its expensive colonial apparatus, but also accumulation and then consumption at home. Marx watched this uprising with compassion and an acute sense of irony, because the insurgents were not exactly the poorest in the complicatedly divided Indian society. In a series of NYDT articles, he offered detailed reportage and confirmed the mutiny as a national revolt in nature, as it incited many mutinies, both within the army and civilian population. Marx and Engels defended the national insurrection, asking, in quote, whether a people are not justified in attempting to expel the foreign conquerors who have so abused their subjects in cold blood. Marx thus explained atrocities committed by the insurgents in terms of the justice of, in his word, historical retribution. Linking revolutions in Asia and Europe, Marx's faith in the Western bourgeoisie creating the material basis of the New World was unshaken until after a decade of watching developments in Asia. Impatient with finding no radical agency and novelty in the Asian uprisings, he did return to an earlier depiction of Oriental immobility and stagnation. Yet profoundly repulsed by the ruined rebellions which were caused by sheer injustice and inhumanity, his standing riddle remained sound, in quote, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? Not only did Marx recognize an anti-colonial nationalist character of the Asian revolts, he also linked it directly to prospective anti-capitalist revolutions in the capitalist strongholds. This idea was original even for Marx himself, whose worldview had always presumed global totality. Referring to both the Taiping and India mutiny, he argued for the possibility of their throwing the spark into the overloaded mine, in his words, on the European continent. What Marx wrote before the end of first revolutionary epoch in Asian history without expected outcomes cannot be dismissed. Disappointed as he was, what remained gratifying, in his words, was that any social upheaval in the Orient, in quote, must have most profound consequences for civilization, end of quote. In a renewed streak of thinking, he stood by his optimistic prediction of revolutions in Asia impacting European republicanism and socialism. Also, contradicting some of his more dismissive assertions, Marx's intuitive supposition here amounted to a milestone in his intellectual trajectory. The East was no longer only a passive victim or an object of history, but a subjective agent, even a forerunner on the eventual transnational revolutionary chain. That is, he now began to make a liberated Asia conditional for European and universal emancipation. The land and village system. This episode of writing about China and India also prepared Marx's turn to Russia in his last years. He became enticed by the Russian Nordics' challenge to the doctrine of capitalist inevitability and especially the potential renewal of the Russian mir. The land question was core to Marx's critique of political economy because land was in both the genesis and expansion of capitalism, central to it. Okay, a word about the village community. Marx classified primitive societies. Okay, it's much better than primitive societies into various stages. The primary, secondary, tertiary types of the village community and emphasized the surviving practice of redistributing the land at fixed intervals like in Russia. Not only did this form allow private homestead while preserving shared use of common properties among the natural members, tribal society could also be democratic, as he believed. Wherever the members were entitled to a real degree of egalitarianism, in his word, it would have made Proudhon shudder. The Russian mir appeared to have survived the 1861 reform. And in Marx's view, the mir had then grown out of an archaic prototype of tribal kinship and attained a level of individualization. This dualism of both public and private incentives could be a basis for the pursuit of collective labor. and the mechanized economy of scale. The problem of isolated existence of communal unit could be overcome by making peasant assembly the governing institution, coexisting with more advanced production in the West. Such communes could appropriate capitalism material and technological achievement without bowing to its modus operandi. These contemplations of 1881 were intended as a reply to Vera Zaslich, accentuating the natural viability of the mere. It may, in quote, it may become the direct starting point of the economic system toward which modern society is tending. And this is what he thinks, what is the newest in what is oldest. For the communal organizations to evade suicide, Marx insisted on the condition of synchronic Russian and Western revolutions. Only so would the proletarian dominance and internationalist aid from the industrial Europe secure a Russian transition, bypassing capitalism. In their 1888 preface to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels paraphrased the conclusion left out from Marx's send letter to Zaslich precisely on this conclusion. Theoretically, it doesn't matter if the Mir actually had neither ancient roots nor a collective tradition, as some researchers argue, if capitalist relations had already penetrated rural Russia in the late 19th century, as Marx feared and Lenin maintained, and if the turn of events dashed any hope as the 1877 Russo-Turkish War ended with Russian victory rather than defeat to stimulate a revolution. At stake is Marx's new vista of the possibility of a backward East to lead the way in a global communist transformation. How long do I have? 5 minutes, okay. I think I'll just skip the stuff here. I'll come to the conclusion. I just conclude on the methodological significance of Asia for Marxism. I'll highlight just a few points from this reading of Marx. One, revolution to begin in the East. Marx wrote in 1877 to a friend that the turbulence in Eurasia could be a new, in quote, a new turning point in European history, and this time the revolution will begin in the East. This groundbreaking idea was prophetic of the revolutionary short 20th century. I mean, mentioning the short 20th century about revolutions, apparently I refer to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Chinese Revolution of 1949. I want to say a word here because I think there are basically two tendencies among the literal intellectuals. One is to disconnect so-called historical communism and Marxism in order to defend Marxism. The other is to connect the two in order to denounce Marxism. I think for us, I mean, at least for me from China, I can say a word about the Chinese Revolution. I know, I mean, people talk about the distortion, I mean, in the Soviet Union, the Stalinist distortion, now in China, Maoist policy disasters and so on. But I think we should not forget how much those revolutions have achieved for the large, very large populations in these countries. And I mean, this is not only me. If you go to China to talk to the common people, especially, you know, striking workers, protesting peasants, and so on, young students, they'll tell you, you know, how much New China made a difference for the majority of the population. I mean, even those who were persecuted during the Cultural Revolution or before the Cultural Revolution had the same view. Like my parents, for example, and my husband spent 14 years in prison and labor camp. They all say that revolution was absolutely necessary. And my Indian friends, for example, whenever I complain about China, they would say, come on, you at least had a social revolution. I think they are right. So I mean, even for the Soviet Union, if you think about what the USSR did, whatever happened internally, it was a break on the imperialist war and money machines, and we no longer have it. So I think we need to be, I don't know, to remember the achievements of these revolutions as well, while not avoiding confronting the mistakes, crimes of those regimes. Okay, I want to say, however, Marx was never a romanticist dreamer and cherished no illusion about agrarian impediments or backwardness. Rather, he cautioned against complacency, the finest chance, in his words, that history has ever offered to a nation to not undergo all the fatal vicissitudes of the capitalist system could be missed quickly if needed conditions were not met. I need one more minute. Okay, 2, non-determinist and non-teleological history. So the fact that Marx's revolutionary East was articulated long before Leninist and Maoist theories and practices remains underappreciated in the Marxist literature. Marx is still largely held responsible, right or wrong, for the theory that ties socialist revolution to the industrialized nations. But neither Leninist nor Maoist revolutions betrayed or negated Marx, who had been there ahead of history to convert Oriental hindrances to stimuli. Okay, 3, beyond unilinear and versus multilinear development. I won't say anything here, but I just say the point is not about unilinear or multilinear, but about not making capitalism as a teleology. So there is an inevitable end of capitalism. And in that sense, we need to make a distinction between two notions, pre-capitalism and non-capitalism. 4, uneven and combined development, I will skip it. And 5, the revolutions, I originally wanted to say a word about Lenin, but I'll skip it. So finally, Asia's methodological function in Marx. The Asian experiences and potential in a comparative perspective served Marx an eloquent arena and pathway that allowed the monumental test of his hope for the viability of communal rejuvenation in a modern socialized production. And this test remains inclusive. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll have to forego the questions, but if I might make so bold, and on behalf of those who have participated in the conference, I want to thank one more time the organizers of this wonderful conference. The conference has been marked by both intelligence and kindness. We wish also to thank those members of the hotel staff who worked so hard to make our stay here pleasant. So very briefly, please join me in thanking not only Professor Lin for her lovely lecture, but also Audrey one more time for this brilliant conference.